Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. The wind blew fast across St. John's, Newfoundland on a hot summer afternoon. It was a day like any other, until it wasn't. At a barn atop Carter's Hill, a lit pipe placed too close to the edge of a table was about to change the course of history for the Atlantic port city. All it took was one spark in a pile of hay to unleash a wild and untamed beast that lit up the sky as it tore through the sun-drenched coastal houses. By dawn, 2/3 of the city had become ashes and thousands were homeless. I'm Craig Baird and this is Canadian History X, and in our fourth and final story focusing on Newfoundland, we are traveling to the end of the 19th century to an event that leveled and reshaped the city. This is the Great Fire of St. John's. Fire! Throughout history, the word has sparked panic in cities across the globe. So much so that falsely yelling the word in a crowded place is illegal and considered dangerous because it could potentially cause serious injury or death. One flame left to its own devices can easily level a city like it did Los Angeles last year. St. John's was also under threat as wildfires roared close to Newfoundland and Labrador's largest city. But fires are nothing new for the port city, going back as far as the early 19th century when a fire broke out in a house near the harbor on February 12, 1816, which spread quickly, fueled by dry conditions and the numerous wooden buildings. By the time it was under control, 120 homes were destroyed and 1,000 people were homeless. The city rebuilt, but a disaster struck again as two fires 7 days apart in December 1817 reduced over 300 buildings to ashes. The Montreal Gazette wrote, quote, "Providence to suffer in the course of the present winter, it will be easily conceived and therefore unnecessary to point out that various forms of misery must exist at the approaching season in so severe a climate amongst a crowded population, thus deprived of shelter and property." Only 2 years later, another terrible fire destroyed at least 130 houses. Now, for those keeping track, that's 4 devastating fires in as many years. But then, the city was granted a reprieve from destruction for the next 3 decades, until June 9th, 1846, and what happened that day was worse than any of the previous disasters. Hamlin was working in St. John's as a cabinet maker. He was working in a shop when a pot of glue boiled over and started a small flame. Before long, it engulfed the shop and then spread to the other buildings. Now at the time, St. John's was a major producer of seal oil and it was well stocked by merchants in the city as it helped fuel the local economy. As it turned out, it would also fuel an inferno when the fire reached their stockpiled barrels and they exploded. To stop the raging fire, firefighters blew up a house on Walter Street to create a fire break. Instead, they scattered embers that blew across the city. By the time it was put out, 2,000 buildings were destroyed, including every merchant warehouse except one. Over 12,000 people, 57% of the city, were left homeless, and it claimed the lives of an artilleryman and 2 civilians. One man was trying to gather his possessions from his burning house. The second was an imprisoned man who was in the courthouse jail when the building burned to the ground. The Montreal Gazette reported, "From the long drought, the wooden tenements, of which the streets were entirely composed, were dry as tinder and the fire extended rapidly." And yet, it wasn't the worst fire the city would see in its history. That wouldn't happen for another 50 years. Since 1846, St. John's had matured into a major coastal city as ships left the harbor and the Grand Banks fed the British Empire. The growth saw a change in the skyline as the colonial building, which became the seat of the government for the island, opened in 1850. The George Street United Church was built in 1873, followed by the St. Patrick's Church in 1881, which was followed then by the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in 1885. By the 1890s, the city population was booming, and homes were built quickly and close together as land was at a premium. However, fire and safety codes were pretty much non-existent. While the fire department was made up of volunteers who were disorganized and inefficient, as crews were inconsistent and high turnover made training difficult. Now, to make matters worse, their equipment, if there was any provided by the city, was mediocre at best, if it was available at all. Old-timers talked of past fires that had once ravaged St. John's, but young people scoffed at the idea of another great fire happening ever again. Everyone assumed that after 1846, the local government would make sure the city was safer. There were recommendations for homes to be built farther apart with wider streets and established fire breaks. But if you've listened to the show before, you know that political leaders too often ignore the advice of experts. And not surprisingly, this is what happened in St. John's. In early July 1892, the local fire department conducted a rarely occurring drill. As I mentioned earlier, the fire department was made up of volunteers who couldn't take time off work to practice and lose a day off. But on this day, those who attended the drill practiced spraying water on a deliberately set fire from a 113,000-liter water tank that was only 7 meters from a barn owned by Timothy Brine. It's very important you remember these details. When training was done, the volunteer firefighters went home. They were either too tired or simply negligent. Either way, they forgot to refill the tank. Everyone assumed someone else would do it. It would take a week for them to realize the magnitude of their mistake, and by then, it would be too late. On July 8, 1892, people in St. John's woke up to a day like any other, and filled with the usual hustle and bustle as children went off to school, fishermen went out on the waves, and the city's restaurants were filled with patrons. The narrow streets, built like European cities with no grid system, were crowded. Backyards were non-existent. A person could reach out of their window and touch their neighbors' houses, which were all mostly made of wood. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Municipal Council Chairman Thomas Mitchell sent out an order to staff warning that the water supply was going to be shut off for the morning so workers could lay down new pipes. He neglected to tell the rest of council or even the city engineer about this. Mitchell didn't think he needed to. After all, the water supply would be turned back on by 3 p.m. However, he also didn't consider the hot summer day ahead as temperatures pushed over 30 degrees Celsius. And with no air conditioning in existence yet, people cooled off the best that they could. Mercifully, a brisk wind helped, but it would soon be a problem. At around 4:45 p.m., on a small farm atop Carter's Hill along Freshwater Road, Timothy Brine was finishing up his day in his barn. He often worked while puffing on tobacco from his pipe. It helped him focus, but that late afternoon, he put his pipe on a table. Distracted by the task at hand, he didn't realize he had placed it in a precarious position on the edge. And then, he walked out of the barn for the day. And with the gentle push of destiny, or maybe even the wind, the lit pipe fell on the dry hay below. A few minutes later, Patrick Fitzpatrick was walking by when he smelled smoke. It didn't take him long to realize where it was coming from as flames were licking the side of the building. Patrick ran to free the cows and the horses. There was little else that he could do as the entire barn was engulfed within minutes. He barely escaped with his own life. At 5 p.m., word of the fire had reached the St. John Central Fire Hall, but firefighters arrived 30 minutes later to find the fire had already spread to other structures. But they weren't worried. There was that large water tank on Brian's farm, after all. All they had to do was hook up their hoses and point the water at the fire. That was when the firefighters realized no one had refilled the tank. Not to worry. They could use the fire hydrants. Firefighters hooked up their hoses, expecting a gush of water, and instead felt a small trickle that barely sprayed their feet. After all, water supply had been turned off to lay new pipes that day. It had been promised to return at 3 p.m., which it was, but the pressure was still too low to force water up the hill to the fire. The firefighters had one weapon left in their arsenal: a fire break. All they needed was hatchets and axes, which the city had failed to provide. They also didn't have any grappling hooks, and when head constable Joseph O'Reilly went looking for something to haul down a building, all he found in the fire station was a single rope. O'Reilly said a few days later, "It was a very old one and broke almost immediately. It was useless for the purpose for which it was intended." If human error and negligence wasn't enough, nature also conspired against St. John's as that brisk wind that helped cool down the city earlier picked up steam and spread embers further and further away. Local business leader W.J. Kent said, "Flames were headway before water was procurable, and as a very high westerly wind was furiously fanning the fire, it began to spread rapidly." What should have been a minor fire was quickly burning out of control, and in less than an hour there would be no containing its destructive force as it traveled down Carter's Hill until it reached the intersection of Harvey's Road and Longs Hill. Residents rushed to grab whatever valuables they could from their homes and then escape to the great cathedrals, but then the fire tore through them as well. The Anglican cathedral was damaged so badly it took a decade to repair. And Bishop Llewellyn Jones described what he saw on that deadly day, stating, quote, "With one fearful rush, the demonic fire seized upon the doomed cathedral, a gem of Gothic architecture, the masterpiece of Sir Gilbert Scott, and the pride of every Newfoundlander, was a seething mass of flame. With a crash heard even above the din of the elements, the roof fell in, and the results of the labors and offerings of thousands for many years vanished in the cloud of smoke and dust." The Inferno entered the downtown core at 8 p.m., 4 hours after it started. By then, the telegraph office had succumbed to the flames and the city was cut off from the rest of the world. To ensure word still got out about the disaster, telegraph operators ran to a safe area and tapped the wires manually to send out messages as the fire raged on. Reverend Moses Harvey described the destruction as, quote, "The beautiful shops full of valuable goods, the stores behind, containing thousands of barrels of flour and provisions of all kinds, the fish stores, the wharves, which had cost immense sums to erect, disappeared one by one into the maw of the destroyer." To escape the embers floating through the air, ships and boats sailed out to sea as they watched the harbor wharves to be engulfed by the blaze. Every road in the city was jammed as people tried to escape, and their screams echoed over the roaring fire and crumbling buildings. The Telegraph Journal wrote, "As building after building went down before the ruthless destroyer, the people of St. John's saw with horror that those structures, which they had regarded as almost essential to the existence of their city, were doomed to destruction." From the water, the glow of the fire in the distance could be seen as it lit up the sky. W.J. Kent said, "Very few were able to sleep after the horror they were witnessing. Ashore, those who took shelter at Bannerman Park and the Roman Catholic Cathedral prayed that the winds wouldn't shift and drive the flames back towards them." As morning broke on July 9th, the fire had finally been brought under control. But by then, 2/3 of the city was in ruins and 11,000 were homeless. The English Episcopal and Roman Catholic cathedrals, which had cost $500,000 to build, were nothing but ruins. The Orange Hall, St. Patrick's Hall, Supreme Court Building, Police Headquarters, Government Savings Bank, and the Christian Brothers School were all gone too. W.J. Kent said, "When morning broke, the thick clouds of smoke still ascended from the burning ruins, and it was hours before it cleared sufficiently to admit a view of the track of the desolating scourge." As Reverend Harvey walked through the city, he saw nothing but utter devastation. Only chimneys and blackened walls barely stood in place and waited to fall. The fire had caused $13 million in damages, 1/3 of which was covered by insurance. The only good news was, this beast had only claimed 3 lives. A fire relief committee was organized 2 days later to handle the disaster response. So many were homeless and living in temporary accommodations in any large public spaces, including Bannerman Park, so the committee helped people find employment and receive training for new jobs. It also distributed the huge amounts of food and clothing and other items that had been sent from Canada and Britain and the United States. Newfoundland and Labrador Governor T.N. Brine raised $113,000 in donations, while the British government provided an additional $72,000. Boston donated $16,000. An editorial in the Halifax Herald stated, "Our sister city is in ruins. Thousands of her fellow subjects are homeless. They must not starve for lack of bread. They need our assistance. Can we deny them?" Canada immediately sent HMS Blake loaded with tents and food and clothes to the island. With most of the harbor destroyed, ships had to shuttle supplies in by smaller boats, the Montreal Star wrote. Newfoundland, with St. John's destroyed, is about in the same position that Britain would be for the munitions of war if Woolwich were in the hands of the enemy. As the city dealt with the impact of the latest fire, municipal leaders finally decided to ensure such a disaster would never happen again. Gone were the volunteer firefighters as the city reorganized the entire department as they hired 22 paid firefighters and built 3 new fire stations. A mixed fire and police force was also created, all under the command of the Inspector General. These recommendations came from Judge D.W. Prowse, who had been tasked with investigating the fire and released a report in which he stated, "The fire department is under the control and management of the municipal council, and the universal experience of every one present of that late fire was that the fire department was a starved, mismanaged, rotten institution. If this department is ever left again in the same hands, all I can say is that we deserve to be burnt." But amid the ruins of that day, something else was born. A city's unique style. When it came time to rebuild, the city turned to architect John Thomas Southcott. The Southcott family had a lot of experience rebuilding cities. John's father and uncle had arrived from England after the 1846 fire to help rebuild St. John's, and over the next 50 years, the family became one of Newfoundland's most well-known contractors. In 1876, John followed in the family footsteps by going to England to study architecture and then returned in 1876. With him, he brought in an affinity for what was known as the Second Empire style, which included dormer windows, mansard roofs, elaborate ornamentation, and Renaissance designs for public buildings and large homes. After the Great Fire, John Southcott designed so many buildings in the city that the Second Empire style was rebranded the Southcott style. And he also changed the city's layout. With so much of the city decimated, gone were the narrow streets. They were replaced with nice wide streets, and homes were built farther apart to offer extra fire protection as a grid system was set up. And today, many of the heritage buildings that now stand in St. John's date from after the 1892 fire. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com. or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.